a lot of surfers may not think of themselves as academics, but really what they're putting together is academic principles, waves, momentum, like pressure points, all of it is physics and a lot of understanding why the ocean is so cute, cool, and beautiful is chemistry as well as interacting with the bathymetry, the shape of the ocean floor beneath it. What's interesting about that is that depending on how big the swell is, it will interact with more or less of the ocean floor beneath it. So, depending on where you're surfing, like East Coast, very gradual, long shore break, you'll see wave energy really directly peter off with swell energy. Like you'll see a very consistent decrease. Whereas if you're somewhere on the West Coast where suddenly you just interact with a shelf or a reef and you feel a ton of friction very quickly, the difference between swell energy and wave energy can be really large depending on what type of swell is coming. Kelp is a very hot topic right now in ocean adaptation. So understanding how can, let's say we can't mitigate our human influence on the world. How do we adapt so that we can lessen our impacts through more natural means? One of those things is kelp.
Hey, amigas. If your algorithm looks anything like mine, then on Instagram or TikTok, you may have seen a content creator that goes by Little Ocean Paige. She is a younger woman with a cute blonde bob, and she's really energetic, and she is talking about ocean science. There's some background information about Nazare and other surf spots, and she is funny and smart and very entertaining. Well, I actually reached out to her in her DMs to see if she wanted to be on the podcast. And of course, her DMs were full of comments. I don't know. I thought she ghosted me. I thought she wasn't interested. And then randomly, she actually reached out to Surf with Amigas to try to connect with us and suggested that she might be a great guest on the podcast. And I was like, yes, absolutely. If you are interested in how a PhD in oceanography goes on to be a TikTok star, then this is the right episode for you. And also, maybe you've seen the wave energy thing on Surfline or Surf Forecast and wondered what that actually means and should you actually be paying attention to it. I have for sure. And I've noticed that recently amigas have been referring to it, and even like non amigas, like my husband and my business partner, Surf with Amigas, Jackie, and our surf instructors, and just people in the water are talking about this energy measurement. I did a little research to try and get to the bottom of it. I don't know that I really got the answer until I talked to Paige, and now I understand. And if you are wondering what that number means, then you should definitely listen to this episode. Where are you in the world, and did you get in the water today?
Great question. I today am in Boulder, Colorado. It's actually where I live now. I did not get into the water today. Unfortunately, I rode my bike, but most days I do get into the water. I was last in the ocean like 2 days ago. I was in Carlsbad, California. I got a little surf trip in, which was awesome. But yeah, none today, but in spirit.
So, how are you a oceanographer person that lives in Colorado? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, great question. Where to begin? I'll give you the short story, the semi-short story. I finished my PhD, a PhD in oceanography. I got it in at UCLA, but I kind of finished it living in like North County, San Diego, so Carlsbad, Encinitas, Cardiff, jumped around there. And by the time I finished my PhD, I was pretty mentally and emotionally just spent. I was just exhausted. We needed a change of pace. My partner and I, Brennan, he was down to go anywhere. And I was born in Colorado. We moved when I was really young, but I've always loved it here. Between undergrad and grad school, I lived in Boulder and I worked at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, which people abbreviate it NCAR, but essentially it's like the NASA of the atmosphere. It's where a lot of really like cutting edge and cool research happens. And a lot of atmospheric science really bleeds into oceanic science because they're just fluids and they interact a lot. And you use a lot of the same instruments to measure both. And so, all that to say, I lived in Boulder for a year before grad school, loved it. I loved it. And then after grad school, the thought was, okay, let's just go to Boulder, let's get a change of pace. And they also have a lot of national labs that would have been perfect for me. So, the National Center for Atmospheric Research, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, um, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. And yeah, we moved out here, took a gamble. I interviewed, and then I ended up getting a job as a research oceanographer here in Boulder at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. I will tell you, has not worked out. It's almost a year ago to the day the current administration took office and uh, laid off everyone that was like provisionally employed through the government, including myself. So, yeah, almost a year ago to the day. I just actually checked the email this morning because I was curious. That was on January 22nd, 2025. And yeah, it has been the worst year of my life, which is funny for I think people to hear knowing me from social media because they're like, "Oh my gosh, this is this how really?" But yeah, it's like I was handed a bunch of lemons and I had to make lemonade. So here I am in Boulder. I still love it here. This place is great. We have really great friends here, and I've been looking for jobs anywhere, but it's a tough time to be a scientist in the United States. There's no two ways about it. And especially here in Boulder, it's been crazy with all the current changes from this administration. So I'm just kind of holding on and making the most of it. But yeah, my parents still live in Southern California. So that's cool. I still have so many friends there. So it's easy for me to go take a trip and see everybody. But it's funny that my heart is so much in the ocean, but it's also so much here in Colorado. So until I find a career, we're going to live where the cost of living is a little bit cheaper, which is here in Colorado. So there's my long-winded answer, but here I am being an oceanographer in Colorado.
Wow, an unemployed oceanographer in Colorado. That is such a there's like so many different directions to go, but I guess you became a TikTok star recently. Like, is this something that are you getting paid to be a TikTok star and make all these super funny, informative videos?
No, a tiny bit here and there. So I started making videos during my PhD. I taught an intro to climate change class at UCLA and a chemical oceanography class, TA'd, like teaching fellow. And it was my students that really encouraged me to start making videos, start making TikToks and reels. I was not on TikTok. I was so like dialed in on my work. I was like, A, I don't have time for that. B, I'm too old. Um, but I always wanted to be a scientific communicator. I've always had this deep passion for research and learning, however, accompanied with conveying that information to other people. I love being a scientist, but I think most scientists don't know how to explain what they do, or we're never given the skills or we're never given the perspective of how important it is. I think it's a kind of poignant time right now, at least in the United States, of how I believe scientific communication has never been more important. When people don't trust scientists, it's not, I think that's actually a failure of scientists themselves, that they didn't burden enough trust or put enough effort into reaching out to the public and showing them, "Hey, this is actually what we're doing is really cool. And like, you can totally understand. Like, let me tell you." So that's always been a deep passion of mine. I had a newsletter before I started making my videos. One of my good friends was at the time, she made like running content. And I also asked her, I was like, "Oh, I'm thinking about making YouTube videos." And she was like, "Do not waste your time." She was on YouTube and all the other platforms. And she was like, "Do not waste your time. Make TikToks. Like what you could do could be done on TikTok." And so that was around 2022, 2023 is when it kind of kicked off. And yeah, then I had, towards the end, the last year of my PhD, so like 2023 into 2024, I had a couple really popular TikToks, all centered around like climate and ocean. And that was really fun for me because it was this opportunity to take a lot of what I've learned. It wasn't always specifically niched into my research, but just more general, like, here's what's going on in the climate, here's what's going on in the ocean, here's an interesting story that you might not know. It was really fun to be able to take a break from my work and then just focus in on what brought me into oceanography in the first place, which was this wonder and this curiosity of, whoa, the earth could do that. That's insane. So I really enjoyed doing that, but I kind of just did it, every once in a while, or if I ever got a good idea when I was like out on a run or swimming, I'd be like, "Oh, I should make a video about that." And then I'd make a video. Uh, Another hesitation I had to even make these videos was I just thought there's no way someone else isn't already doing this. Like, this is such a cool, easy subject in my head. It must be totally oversaturated. There must be so many people making this like oceanographic, atmospheric science, climate science, short form content. What, like, I can't be the first person who's had this idea. Um, for whatever reason, no one's really been doing it, which is super low hanging fruit. Why have we not all been doing this? Anyways, I never really took off on Instagram because my Instagram Reels used to only be a minute and 30 seconds. And I think it was this time last year that they made them 3 minutes, which that I can work with. I can convey a lot of information pretty quick, but a minute and a half is just far too quick to explain like an oceanographic concept without me going. So, yeah, once Instagram allowed reels that were a little bit longer, I just took what I was posting on TikTok and put it on Instagram. And that's been great. And I'm shocked and honored to have really taken off in the surfing community in the last couple of months. I am surprised and I'm not surprised. Surfers are smart people, very smart. You need to be able to understand physics. You need to be understand atmospheric science. A lot of surfers may not think of themselves as academics, but really what they're putting together is academic principles, waves, momentum, like pressure points, all of it is physics and a lot of understanding why the ocean is so cute, cool, and beautiful is chemistry. And yeah, so I just figured like scientists can convey this, but surfers also know it. You just need to put it into terms that are a little bit more digestible. So yeah, I've been really pleasantly surprised to really tap into the surf community on Instagram and TikTok over the last couple of months. So a year ago today, I lost my job, and then I took a temporary scientist position at UC Santa Barbara. That was from February to August. And then since August of this last year, I have been job searching and I've had a lot more time to do my science communication stuff, which has been such a treat. And that's when I really started taking off on kind of my wave analysis videos. It's been great. I've not really gotten paid, but it's awesome.
I think it's interesting that you mentioned that surfers are smart. And I mean, anytime you make a generalization about any one thing like surfers, which makes so many different types of people, it's like I feel like surfers who and I'm talking about people who have like been surfing for a minute, people who like
Hmm.
know how to catch waves and they
Yes.
know more or less what type of waves work for them and they have like a general understanding of like the surf forecast but I feel like a lot of that knowledge is just sort of like it's like felt knowledge or like
Mm,
intuitive knowledge, but they don't necessarily have the scientific background to understand why that is. It's like they might notice
yes.
like, oh, I like the feeling of a swallowtail, or when it is a 20-second period swell, the wave is going to be like bigger and more powerful. But to take that like those like knowings and like be able to understand like why
Mm,
that is for their own knowledge or even to be able to explain why that is, that's what I feel like most surfers cannot do. And
yep.
unless somebody comes from a background in science or a lot of the people that I interact with are people who learn to surf as adults. And so they're
Mm,
maybe like they want to understand surfing, but they haven't been able to put in decades of time that would allow them to like feel these things. So like
yes.
approaching it from starting with the why and then going to the feeling, I feel like can kind of like jumpstart. And then surfers that can like feel it, then understanding the why just like deepens their understanding of the experience.
Yes.
And that's where I feel like
Yes.
your videos are great. So I'm gonna pick your brain. I'm gonna ask you a question.
Please.
And I really want the answer because I don't know the answer. You ready?
Okay, please. I'm ready.
Okay. Uh can you understand or help me understand? Can you explain the whole surfline wave energy thing? Is that something that you believe in? That you agree with? Like, where are they getting those numbers?
Yes.
It's new, right? Like for me, who I've been surfing for 30 years now or so, and like it's only in the last like few years that the whole wave energy thing is there. And I think it started with like surf-forecast.com, and all of a
Hmm.
sudden people were talking about the energy, and I'm like, what are they talking about? And now Surfline's doing it. And so I am sort of starting to like pay attention to it, but like the numbers don't seem to align always with my experience. And then I like looked it up. I was like, I want to understand because I'm one of those surfers that like I have this feeling, but I want to understand the why. And so I did a little bit of initial research. I looked at what Surfline says. I consulted the robot at ChatGPT, but I want to ask you.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. So, if you're thinking about the energy of any wave, so not even just a like surfing wave, but any wave, a sound wave, a wave of light on the electromagnetic spectrum, there's a couple different things that determine the energy of a wave. So, that could be the amplitude. How high is the actual wave, right? That could be the period, so how long between those peak amplitudes, the frequency within that, and other things like the actual time and distance that that wave has gone through. How long has that swell traveled from that storm to you? So let's start with swell energy. Swell energy is easier, I think, to interpret because swell energy is pretty much a direct function of the amplitude and the wavelength, give or take. There's like an actual formula you can use, but that's how much energy is in the swell. So if there's a well-developed storm out in the Pacific, it travels over a long period to get to you, big waves, big periods, a lot of energy that's being transferred. Then, to make it more specific to wave energy, that has to do with the interaction of the actual shoreline of where that swell has traveled to. Because a wave breaks because of friction underneath the water. Friction removes energy. And so, to get to the specific number, translating swell energy into wave energy has to do with understanding how that swell is interacting with the bathymetry, the shape of the ocean floor beneath it. What's interesting about that is that depending on how big the swell is, it will interact with more or less of the ocean floor beneath it. So, depending on where you're surfing, like East Coast, very gradual, long shore break, you'll see wave energy really directly peter off with swell energy. Like you'll see a very consistent decrease. Whereas if you're somewhere on the West Coast where suddenly you just interact with a shelf or a reef and you feel a ton of friction very quickly, the difference between swell energy and wave energy can be really large depending on what type of swell is coming. So big swell could interact suddenly with a reef offshore that it wouldn't interact with if it was a small swell. The small swell can travel closer to the shore. So all this to say, if you were reading swell energy, I think that would be a little bit of a simpler, that one's more easy to comprehend. But when you're talking about wave energy, when you're calculating wave energy, you need to take into account what's going on underneath the surface. And depending on where you are in the world, those bathymetric maps and charts are better or worse than others. So, if you have a really poorly resolved area, or for example, there's an offshore sandbar that moves with the seasons, that's an ephemeral measurement. That's also really hard to take into account. So I would take it all with a grain of salt and also think about what what's your instinct telling you about the ocean floor there? Is it a permanent reef somewhere like Hawaii where, you're at Pipeline, for example, it's the third reef. That should never change. But if you're somewhere where the sandbar really shifts a lot, maybe it's further onshore, those measurements could vary a ton between like what's true and what's forecasted just because the beach itself is changing and it's hard to account for that when you're making a computer model.
Well, I wanna pick that apart a little bit. So I hear you differentiating between wave energy and swell energy. So that number that's being displayed on Surfline or Surf Forecast, are they talking about wave energy or swell energy?
Believe swell, I think it's wave energy. If it's different per spot, it's wave energy. If it's kind of the same for a general region, it's swell energy. But I actually haven't looked at that in a long time.
Yeah, I am not a scientist, but I teach how to read a surf forecast as one of the classes
Mhm.
that we do at Surf with Amigas. And so I I developed this understanding for myself that has been borne out by experience that there is a math equation that proves that a longer period swell is going to be more powerful. It's going to, of course, it depends on bottom contour and all that. So then when this wave energy thing came in, I Googled, and then Surfline will tell you the formula that they use. And they actually say that it says, like, did you think that the period was the key to the swell of power? Like 2 feet at 20 seconds might be more effective at creating the type of waves you want to ride, but has less power. And I don't think Surfline, for all of their benefits, is great at explaining things, especially not this
Mm,
concept, because they're basically saying that power is the swell height squared multiplied by the period and some coefficients, which means that the height has proportionally more effect on power than period. And that was the part that was baffling to me because
yeah.
I felt like it went against the research I had done in the past and my own experience. Like, obviously, height matters, but like my understanding was that period mattered more. And now Surfline is saying something different. Like, am I misunderstanding Surfline? Are they wrong? Like, what is going on here?
Yeah, so there can be truth in both. So when we're talking about the actual the generation of swell, right? Let's go back to the generation of swell. You're in a gigantic storm. Let's say that you're in a storm off in the Pacific. Let's actually just say you're in a whatever, category 2 typhoon. There's energy for sure. Let's say it stalls over the open ocean and it generates a nice organized long period swell. Fantastic. that amount of time that wind blows over waves, you may be familiar with the term fetch. Um, that might give you a nice long fetch, but that wind blowing over the waves might be, I don't know, 100 miles per hour, maybe less, maybe 80 miles per hour. Great. But if it stalls over the ocean, that's a long time for that energy to be put into the waves. Now, compare that to a super strong storm. Super strong storm, same situation. It stalls. Those winds might be 140 miles per hour. And that could generate longer periods, but also could generate just higher wave heights because it's stronger when it has more force to disform the sea surface. And so you think about what has more energy, that, category 5 or a category 2 storm, category 5 storm. So what this is like, what this is getting at is that a storm may be able to generate nice, long, organized periods. And long, organized periods can be indicative of a very strong storm and a very powerful swell. But you can also get nice, long, organized periods from a storm that was powerful enough. But when you're thinking about which storm put more energy into the water, the category 5, realistically, and maybe they have the same period, but one's going to have a higher wave height. And that higher wave height was because that initial storm had more energy. When it comes to like power, um, power, you can argue is like, is it even the best way to indicate? Power is one of those indicators where it's like, okay, so like, d yeah, it's thinking about what matters for you when you're looking at the waves you want to ride. Because yeah, it's an amalgamation of these things. It's like the period, yes, but it's also definitely the wave height.
Well, wait, can I pause you then? Because like that makes sense to me if we're talking about, a category 2 and a category 4. And if the wavelength is equal or similar, like let's say one is 18 seconds and one is 19 seconds, but the 19 seconds is 2 feet at 19 and the other one is like 5 foot at 18. Like that makes sense to me. If the period
Mhm.
is equal, then yes, of course, wave height. But I guess what my confusion would be more like a, 2 foot at 19 seconds versus a powerful storm that was like really close to shore. So maybe like a really strong wind that didn't have the long fetch to really transfer all that energy. So let's say that you get a 5 foot at 8 seconds versus a 2 foot at 20 seconds. Like, I realize
Mm.
that there's a lot of questions about the different things, but like, let's say that you're focused on a place like Swami's, like
Mhm.
a Point
Mhm.
Break that obviously likes the long period swell. If you get a 2 foot at 20-second period swell versus a 5 foot at 8 second swell, like maybe the 5 foot at 8 second it's going to be a higher wave, a taller wave, but is it going to
Huh.
have as much power? And how do you compare those two things? And that was where I was surprised by the formula.
Yes. So one important thing to think about here is like the distribution of power, right? So if you have a 20-second period, that like the power is distributed over a much longer, like a much longer area, whereas a small wave. And so that's when that's again when power, it's like, okay, power is interesting, but when you're these are the power's being distributed over different scales too. So if you think about like a long period wave, and I need to actually see what the specific units for power that they use, but if it's a unit,
Kilojoules.
kilojoules. Okay, yeah. So that takes into account like a specific amount of area. So a kilojoule is kilograms per meter squared per like over second squared. So it is the unit of energy is taking into account space and time. So, although you may be able to, like, space and time are both very important when you're looking at this transfer of energy. And again, they're taking up such different amounts of space and they're going over such different periods of time. Like that 20-second swell compared to that traded 5 5 foot or whatever over, 12 seconds. Um Base taking up less space. And so it's going to be more concentrated. Again, take it all with a grain of salt. Like energy might not be the most important thing to determine whether it's a wave you even want to ride. Like, do you want to even ride that? It's like, is that what you are most interested in? But it's partially because in the actual unit, it's taking into account space. So I would need to draw it out to give you like a great explanation.
Well, I look forward to the next TikTok that covers this topic, and I will share it far and wide because I have noticed that now wave energy has become
Mhm.
where people who don't understand, all of the other numbers, like they look at the very first column, that like 2 to 3 feet, and then they look at the wave energy and like that's it. And it's kind of is annoying to me, question mark. I don't know what the right word is. Like, I'm just
Yeah.
like, that's not, that number doesn't feel that meaningful. I mean, I can see the benefit in comparing, like, just like you do the first column, like, okay, it's saying today is 2 to 3 and tomorrow's 3 to 4 and the next day is 5 to 7 and then back to 1 to 2. Like, I notice it as like a trend that, okay, 2 to 3 seems meaningless to me based on what I'm seeing at the beach, but it's supposed to be bigger tomorrow and bigger the next day, and then it's going to drop off. And I sort of see wave energy in the same way. But I wonder for somebody like you, who especially now is a landlocked surfer that only surfs on vacations, like if
Yeah.
you're looking at the forecast, like what are you looking at? Like what numbers there are meaningful to you?
I'm looking at period height and wind. Like, is the wind onshore or offshore? Is the period good enough? What size board do I need to bring according to the height? Like, again, yeah, I think the energy is interesting if you're like super in the weeds and you surf a spot super frequently and you want it dialed. I think also energies, it's something that's interesting to incorporate once you know a spot well. And then you can say, okay, this day was kind of heavy. What was the energy? And this day was a little bit like easier, shortboard didn't work. What was the energy? But for me personally, it's interesting. I'm a longboarder primarily, so I'm just looking at the period. I'm looking at the wave height, and the wind, honestly, because again, no matter what the energy is, if it's not coming from the right direction, and if the wind's not helping you out, what does it matter? So, yeah, I just want to be in like conditions that I know will be pleasant. And more energy isn't necessarily a good thing. Like, I'd rather surf, say it's 4 to 5, I'd rather surf 4 to 5 with a 20-second period than 4 to 5 with a 5 second period. That would suck. Oh, I get pounded. So, yeah, again, I think energy is interesting, but I'm looking at, and when I advise anyone to start being more conscious of the conditions when they're surfing, I'm telling them, look at the wind. I think we all underestimate the power of wind because that shapes the wave as it's coming in. So look at the wind, look at the period. The rest can kind of just fall into place.
Awesome. I love that. Thank you so much for validating my own experience. I did not necessarily happen, but I appreciate you for that.
Yes, yes.
Talking about, I feel like for me also, like, I agree with you 100% that
Mm,
wind will make or break a session. But what I don't know is really where to look for reliable wind forecasts. I mean, again, I think
yeah.
most surfers I experience use Surfline and their wind forecast is generally not great. Do you use Windy or do you have a better one even?
I'll use windy. It depends on where you are in the world. So a lot of wind forecasting is interesting because depending on what country you're on, what region you're in, there just might not be enough sensors to give an accurate representation of what the wind is doing and what it should do. I would check if Windy's not giving you a satisfactory forecast. I would check Wonderground. It's W Underground because that incorporates local sensors. So like people that put sensors on their house. And there's a lot of like weather and aviation geeks out there that very generously share the data that their little weather station is generating. And even if the forecast even if you don't really trust the forecast, again, it's just kind of that like intuition when you live in a place long enough and be like, okay, generally the wind is rising at this time, falling at this time, or oh, this time of year, what's the wind typically doing? Obviously there's like variations of that with storms, with weather patterns, but I would check one of those generally around the time that you want to surf. Those have a better distributed array of sensors than like, weather.com. You can always check if you're in the United States, you can check the National Weather Service in your local area, but they also might not have sensors in the areas that you want sensors. So it's kind of an interesting game when it comes to like really fine tuning surf forecasts. I think a lot of us just take in the surf forecast, but don't really know where it comes from. Like, where are they even getting the data? They're getting the data from, depending on who's you're looking at, from a very wide array of satellites, of buoys, of some weather sensors. And it's kind of incredible that it all comes together. What we don't get to see as consumers of the forecasts is how high resolution are the sensors in that specific area that put together your forecast. So it shouldn't, my intuition, I've never actually looked, but my intuition is that it would be harder for Surfline to forecast Nicaragua than Swami's, because what do we have in the United States? We have the National Weather Service. We have a lot of satellites, a lot of Earth sensing satellites that can give us a lot of measurements. But like compared to Nicaragua, like I don't know what their buoy network looks like. I'm assuming it's not as robust. And, who knows? Also, maybe there's cloud cover that also has to do with some of these instrumentation and measurements and interference and how much can these sensors be maintained. It will depend so much on where you are and what resources do they have to tell what the ocean and the atmosphere is doing. Then you can kind of get an understanding of, okay, what do I actually think is accurate here? What do I trust? What do I have to take with a grain of salt? Um, but yeah, it all comes down to what sensors are available, which I don't think the average surfer is like, what sensors am I checking? But at the same time, I know there are some like old school surfers which I love. I'm this way. Like in California, for example, you can check CDIP. I can't even remember what the acronym stands for, but they're buoys offshore and you can check like the live period and the live weather temperature and the live wind, which like there's no better forecast than a nowcast. So if you're in one of those places where you have the liberty of just like checking that day, awesome. It's awesome. But yeah, a forecast is inherently wrong. That's why it's a forecast, So it's like you have to find the way to interpret it that makes the most sense to you.
Yeah, that's great. I grew up in my 20s, I should say, like checking CDIP when I lived in
Yeah.
California.
Yeah.
And I
Yep.
think some people in Hawaii still do because I know that there's like a lot of surf forecasting. But when you talk about the wind, I understand that buoys are out there in the ocean and they're feeding that data into the computer model to make the forecast prediction. But you mentioned wind sensors, like just
Mhm.
as if I had never really thought about it's basically a buoy for wind that individuals have on their houses. Like, can you say more about that?
Yeah, totally. So the seated buoys also should have, like actual wind gauges on them. But in addition, you can buy yourself a little, amateur like weather meteorology kit for your house. And those come with uh, a sensor of pressure. So like some bathymetrics, so that can understand, is a storm coming? Are we in a high pressure system, low pressure system? It will also come with a wind gauge. It'll tell you where the wind is coming from, what direction, and how fast. Yeah, and then it'll obviously come with like a temperature gauge and a humidity gauge. So you can tell, what's the dew point today, how humid is it, how dry is it. But a lot of people buy these sensors for their own houses. And if you go onto Wonderground, I know there are some other websites that bring in this data, but Wonderground is the biggest one that I use personally in the United States. They have a pretty great sensor network. Then you can go in and you can actually, like, if there's one particular sensor that you really, really like, you can like pick it, and also there are good sensors around local airports because weather matters more to aviation than surfing, like it's life or death for aviation. So if you ever really need like, oh, I don't trust, like, trust the sensor at the airport. Look at the airport's weather measurements because they're the ones that need to know the most what is happening right now in terms of pressure, temperature, wind direction, and wind speed. But yeah, it's kind of fascinating. I think it's a really cool hobby that's growing, or these, backyard meteorology, uh, yeah, like aficionados. I think that's a really fun and cool hobby. And it's good for us because the more data, the more a model can assimilate, the more we can get closer to finer tuned forecasts and just more accurate forecasts.
I love it. So I want to hear about your story. Like, where did you
Mm.
grow up and how did you get into surfing? And at what point in your surfing career did you start getting interested in the science behind it?
Absolutely. I grew up inland Southern California, Redlands, if you're familiar. It's between like LA and Palm Springs, is what I tell people. But my grandmother lived in San Diego. She lived in like the Claremont neighborhood. But when we would go down to visit her, my parents, specifically my mom, would take us to Del Mar. I love Del Mar. That's like, I think of that as like my hometown beach, even though it was like an hour and a half from where I grew up. But I knew from a very young age I wanted to be an oceanographer. I remember watching a documentary with Dr. Bob Ballard, who is the guy who discovered the Titanic, if you've heard that name before. And in this documentary, it's showcasing his oceanographic career. Specifically, he found the battleship Bismarck, but it's showing how he's living on this boat and using all these tools like sonar and some imagery to find this lost vessel. And at the time, I was so young, but I was like, that's a job. Like, you could just explore the ocean as a job. Yeah, sign me up. Absolutely. I always loved going to the beach and even just sitting in the shore break and like feeling the energy of the waves. And the waves always keep coming. They never stop. Sometimes they slow, sometimes they're weaker or stronger, but there's always waves. And I think that physical interaction always really fascinated me. I always loved the beach. I always loved being in water, the feeling of weightlessness. So always beach kid, fascinated with that. Grew up going every, month or every couple of months and just enjoying it. And then when it came time to pick a college, I knew I wanted to do oceanography. And I ended up going to UC Santa Barbara for my undergrad, which was the best thing that's ever happened to me, point blank. And from there, that's when I think I learned how to surf in earnest. I had like bodyboarded before and boogie boarded, and but that's where I really, really learned to surf. And because if you've ever been, there's Devs, which is this beautiful point break. There's Campus Point, which is a point break. I mean, it's literally on the water. One of my majors was in the geography department. They have a class, geography of surfing. And once a month, I think they still do this. They had like surf with the chair. Like you surf with the chair of the department. Like once a month there would be like a, group outing to go surf with the chair of the department, which is just so cool. and yeah, and I had all the access in the world to the ocean, and it was just the best. So that's when I really kind of got into it in earnest. And then for graduate school, I went to UCLA, but I was in Santa Monica for a while, and so that was like Sunset and Topanga, and then continued surfing down in North County when I moved down there. By the time I was finishing my PhD, I actually got really into open water swimming, which was another like really cool way to interact with the ocean because no matter what the waves are doing, you can swim. And that was a really wonderful experience for me as well. So yeah, there's just so much wonderful community in surfing and swimming too that I love ocean people. I love being around ocean people. I love interacting with the ocean in any way. Sailing, fishing, surfing, swimming, beach combing. I don't really care. Whatever gets me in and around the water is worth my time. So, yeah, I've always had that itch and that bug, and that's it's manifested in my life in like really wonderful ways. So very grateful to have grown up close enough to the ocean to be privy to access it, multiple times a year. Not everyone is so lucky. That's one thing that I think is really cool about my content too, is I get comments or messages from people like, I live in Arkansas, but like this had my attention, or like I never even thought about this. Like I live in Minnesota, in like people that live in landlocked states and countries still find my content and experience the wonder of the ocean in a small way. And that is so cool because it's easy to forget, especially growing up in Southern California. It's like, oh, doesn't everyone, like, doesn't everyone lifeguard? Doesn't everyone surf and this and that, and then you broaden your horizons. It's like, wow, we're so lucky. We're so lucky. And for me to be able to share it in this cool way is a very big gift in my life. So that I've really enjoyed.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think it is interesting to put that in perspective because, like, what you said is true. Like, you just take, I mean, I could see the ocean right now. It's easy to take that for granted. Um, so then what was your thesis? Like, what did you actually focus on in your PhD?
Yeah. So in my PhD, I was looking at more specifically the Southern California Bight, SCB, but that it goes from San Diego up to Point Conception, that kind of area of water in Southern California. Looking within this area, what are nutrients doing? So when I say nutrients, I'm talking about nitrate and phosphate, which are what phytoplankton need to consume to actually, they need sunlight, they need uh a decent water temperature, they need nutrients. They're just like a tree, just like any other plant. So, looking at the distribution of nutrients in the Southern California Bight, and more specifically, anthropogenic, so human sources of nutrients. So, in Southern California, for example, they treat and then pump about 1 billion gallons of wastewater every day back out into the ocean. Now, you hear that and you go, ick, that's scary. But it's treated wastewater, so it's not organic nutrients. It's treated back into inorganic nutrients. So that's what, wastewater treatment facilities are for. So you would not get sick. You would not get sick from treated wastewater. Now, when there's an issue or a plant, something goes offline, or there's like extra storm water or whatever, if something happens and that wastewater is not treated, that's when you get sick. But secondary treated wastewater is okay. However, it's still an increase of nutrients in the ocean. And an increase of nutrients in the ocean can cause what we call eutrophication. And eutrophication is a bloom of phytoplankton triggered by excess nutrients. Eutrophication is not always horrific. It's not always like it's going to kill everything, but it can really cause, even in small amounts, imbalances in the food chain. So I was really focused on understanding where human nutrients were ending up in Southern California and what that could mean for potential eutrophication or what that could also mean for kelp growth. 'Cause kelp is a plant too. And I mean, you've lived in Southern California, you know, giant kelp is like just a part of the iconography of that wonderful coastline. So understanding, do our human created nutrients interact with the growth of giant kelp in Southern California? And it was awesome. The way I actually studied these relationships was through a model, through a high resolution model. So I have a lot of empathy for modeling and forecasting because inherently, like I said before, it's incorrect. It's the best we can do, but we'll never have the true truth. But you can get pretty close, all things considered. And so I worked with these like high resolution models that were generated by other people in my lab. And I kind of interpreted the results in the lens of, okay, where could eutrophication be occurring over what periods of time? And then could these nutrients also be interacting with those really important ecosystems of giant kelp in Southern California?
But like,
Yeah.
I mean, what do you even do with that kind of data? Like, is the idea that you share it and say that we need to change policy to protect the kelp, or is it just like, okay, now we have this information and that's nice?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. With kelp specifically, kelp is a very hot topic right now in ocean adaptation. So understanding, how can, let's say we can't mitigate our human influence on the world. How do we adapt so that we can lessen our impacts through more natural means? One of those things is kelp. Kelp kelp is like a prolific grower. Kelp in the right conditions can grow like gangbusters. And so it's more widespread in Asia, but kelp farming is becoming a pretty hot topic as well. So the idea is that, well, so let's say there's excess human nutrients in the ocean. What takes up a lot of nutrients quickly? Kelp. And so thinking about, well, it's important to understand these relationships so that potentially if we wanted to mitigate human impacts on the ocean, maybe we could find more suitable locations for kelp farms to grow us extra resources and to get rid of, excess human impacts and potentially buffer some of these eutrophication impacts, like win-win. So that's kind of the goal, is to understand how is it impacting the natural environment first, and then thinking about, okay, that's naturally growing kelp. If we were to farm kelp, if we were to seed kelp forests, how could we do this in a smarter way? How could we do this in a more informed way so that everyone's a winner here?
That sounds good. So, kind of coming full circle to how we started the conversation, going to the current administration and the impact that that's had on scientists, like what is the vibe? Is it kind of like we just going to hunker down and hope that the administration changes and there's more resources for science as climate catastrophe gets worse and suddenly people realize, wait a minute, we need the scientists. They got to help us out of this. Or are people in that industry just starting to like move on and try and do different things?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the answer is going to vary depending on who you talk to. I have been all over the place personally because, like, I'm in a pretty vulnerable spot because I just finished my PhD and I'm just starting my career, and I kind of was in the wrong place at the wrong time in terms of what it means for me personally. So I'll try not to give a super negative answer. But for me it was a really it's been a tough situation. However, I think a lot of people, depending on, if we're talking specifically about just federal agencies, so like the Environmental Protection Agency, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, Department of Energy, there's so much great science happening at these places that is related to climate and climate adaptation and climate study. That's ocean and atmosphere. I think a lot of people are trying to find ways to just continue to do their science or to slightly modify their science for a couple of years in a way that allows them to keep up their practice, but maybe in ways that don't don't cause them to lose funding or draw negative attention from, like the powers that be. I think a lot of people are moving. A lot of people are like, just go to France, just go to Norway. They're offering more postdocs and like PhD positions, especially in like earth and environmental science. I think a lot of people are towards the end of their career are like retiring early or stepping down and going into like maybe, kind of a broader consultant type of role. It's really a mixed bag. I do believe some people are like holding fast and staying true to what they believe in. For myself personally, I don't really know what I'm gonna do. I've been, applying here and there for these rare jobs that do pop up in private industry, but private industry doesn't really fund oceanography. It's a very expensive practice. In oceanography, you need sensors, you need satellites, you need buoys, you need ships. And by nature, most oceanography is federally sponsored in some way. Even if you're not a federal scientist, you are using a federal grant or you're working in collaboration with someone that is able to provide the insurance, the boats, the, you know, scientific background to be able to um, come up with these like really interesting analyses, but that require really large scale and broad tools. So I'll have to say, I don't really know what's next for me. If anyone listening to this needs an oceanographer, let me know. But for me personally, at least for the here and now, I think what I'm doing is a valuable use of my time. I think I've brought science to the attention of a lot of people that potentially wouldn't have been so inclined in the first place or just thought, it's not, physics isn't really for me, or like, oh, I'm not really a math person. My hope is to like secretly get into all those people's brains and maybe get them to think, well, maybe I am actually a physics person. I understand that. Yeah, and hopefully from that, I'm holding out hope that job will come from it and a career will come from it. But like I said, right now, I've gotten a few little deals here and there, but I'm not really getting paid. No one really pays for people to talk about science because who who is that? What business is that lucrative for? Not really many. So yeah, I'm doing my thing and I'm hoping, and I know that the momentum for people who believe in protecting our earth and ocean and science, that won't ever fade. But I think we're in kind of unprecedented times in terms of, okay, wow, there's a lot of there's a lot of roadblocks right now. What can I do that's still a valuable use of my time and my skills? And hopefully be able to pivot it back to exactly what I'm passionate about maybe in a couple of years. But for right now, I think it's just like holding the line.
Yeah, that's tough. Just waves of love to you. High energy
Thank
waves of love.
you. Thank you.
Yeah. So if you were to, here's your, I know you have your short form pulpit on
Mhm.
Instagram and TikTok.
Mhm.
If anybody hasn't checked it out, we'll put the links in
Mm.
the show notes. But like,
Mhm.
what would be your message for all your knowledge and all your vast experience for people who are listening? Like, what message do you have on any topic at all?
That's a great question. I would say get curious and be chalant. Like nothing great was ever achieved without enthusiasm. That's an Emerson quote, but I believe it to be true in all aspects of life. Do things with enthusiasm and just be curious about the world and environment around you. Curiosity is like one of the gifts of humanity. It's one of the gifts of who we are. And most people probably listening to this come from a place where they're lucky enough to explore their curiosity. But I think a lot of us have forgotten in this current digital day and age where we're fed things and we're just going and we're kind of on like, an easy track. Like maintain your curiosity, keep learning. Learning is a gift. You need to continue learning even if you're not in school. And that's one of like I think one of the most precious gifts in life is to be able to explore your curiosity and to do it with fervor, do it with enthusiasm. Eh, you know, people love when you express yourself with pride and with interest and with like unabashed just enthusiasm.
Yes, I love that. I love that so much. I feel like sometimes people, in my own experience, when I think about like enthusiasm, I feel like sometimes people are like, "Ooh, you're too much." Like that feels
Mm,
intimidating. Like
yes.
I'm afraid to engage with you on this topic because of how passionate you are. Um but yeah, but I think you're right. As coming from an enthusiastic, passionate person
Mhm.
that also likes to learn, you're speaking to the choir here. I think that that is really important, and that it's easy to just be like so too chill and like blasé and get into the scroll hole of your own echo chamber. But it's good.
Mhm.
It's good to
Yeah,
explore other things and
I
push yourself. So
agree.
thank you so
I
much
agree.
for sharing your story, and thanks for getting into the weeds a little bit on the
Oh my
wave
gosh, happy
energy and stuff.
to. The wave energy video is coming. It's been
Yes,
on
I
my
can't
list for a
wait.
long time. This has totally motivated me to be like, actually, I need to make this right now because it is a really interesting and like slightly complicated thing that we all need to have a come together moment to be like, this is how we interpret it moving forward. I agree. I'm happy to dive in.
Awesome. All right. Well, I can't wait to see it and to share it widely. And yeah, thank you again.